Hi, folks. I'm Ken Harmon, editor and founder of West Trade Review. Welcome to another episode of the West Trade Review Postscript interview series. Today, we're very happy to have with us Richard Blanco. Richard was selected by President Obama as the fifth presidential inaugural poet in U.S. history. He was the youngest, the first Latinx, immigrant, and gay person to serve in that role. In 2023, Blanco was awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Biden from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Born in Madrid to Cuban exile parents and raised in Miami in a working-class family, Blanco's personal negotiation of cultural identity and the universal themes of place and belonging characterize his many collections of poetry, including the most recent, Homeland of My Body, which reassesses traditional notions of home, a strictly a geographical, tangible place that merely exists outside us, but rather within us. He has also authored the memoirs For All of Us, One Today, An Inaugural Poet's Journey, and The Prince of Los Cocuyos, A Miami Childhood. Blanco has received numerous awards, including the Agnes Starrett Poetry Prize, the PEN America Beyond Margins Award, the Patterson Prize, and a Lambda Prize for Memoir. He was Woodrow Wilson Fellow and has received numerous honorary degrees. Currently, he serves as Education Ambassador for the Academy of American Poets and is an Associate Professor at Florida International University. In April 2022, Blanco was appointed the first ever Poet Laureate of Miami-Dade County. Welcome, Richard. We're happy to have you with us today.
Glad to be with you, Ken.
Let's just start with some maybe sort of a couple of broad philosophical questions. I always like to hear how poets first come to poetry. When did you first become fascinated with words and story and meaning making? And how did that evolve into an interest in poetry for you?
Well, if you would have asked me that question about a year and a half ago, my answer would have been different. But I'll give you that answer first. I always thought it had to do actually with engineering. For those in our audience of engineering, so that they know it was my first degree and my first career for 25 years. And much to my surprise, when I started working at my consultant office, half my job is writing reports and studies and letters and most importantly, writing proposals and understanding that a proposal is nothing but a narrative of your vision for a project, and that a good proposal, you get a $40 million job in the house, who gets promoted. Anyway, I started really understanding or feeling language in a way I never had before. Also seeing how language is also very practical, something you need in almost any career, but also understanding all the differences between audience, tone, how you have to write to certain people in certain ways, how you have to write to other people in certain ways. And then I just started geeking out on language, and so I'd like to say, and I started saying, I should back up. I've always been a left brain, right brain kid. So I always knew I wanted to do something creative in addition to what I was doing as an engineer. So I thought, well, this language thing is kind of cool. What do I know nothing about? Poetry. Study poetry. So I first went to a couple of community college classes, and then eventually, started writing really horrible poems, of course, because my sense of poetry I don't think I even read a living poet. It was so archaic, like most of us start when we start writing poetry. And so eventually I got into the MFA program at FIU, all the while still working as an engineer, and until the White House called, pretty much I was engineer by day, poet by night. So, but I recently realized, because it still didn't make sense to me. I mean, I get it. You found language, you're curious about language, but why poetry? Like, why? And I realize now that I never remember not knowing two languages in my life. So I remember translating for my parents at 3 or 4 years old. Obviously not whole conversations, but, phrases or words for things. And I guess I learned at an early age, it would imprinted in me that language is, first of all, I didn't take language for granted. I was hyper aware of language, but also that it was not just a way of communicating, but a way of thinking, a way of breathing in the world, a way of understanding the world. And I think when it came time to do something creative, or I should say, that I think that clicked when I went into my engineering office and started looking at language, and I think there was a natural connection there. So that's been that took me only till I was like, what, 54 to figure that out.
So, what do you think the role of the poet is in culture, and how's your view of that maybe changed or evolved over time?
Yeah. I mean, I often like to make analogies between poetry and music, because I think it comes to us in similar ways, and it's also received by audiences in similar ways. As we all, probably our audience knows, the idea of the poem on the page is a fairly new thing still, right? So um, I think the role of the poet, I always say, is to, again, the analogy with music is to really build something based on emotion. It's really about an emotional appeal. And that has a way of reaching people as an art form that other, like music, but that others don't. And I think part of I mean, every poet has their own nuances on what they think, poetry should do or does or can do. But for me, it attaches a real face, a real name, a real smile, a real tears of joy and real tears of pain to issues that can get highly abstracted, especially in social political issues. So a poem, to me, bears witness to humanity in some ways. And of course, there's a great irony in that, because it's really, again, like a singer-songwriter, you're putting your life on the line, as a way for other people to connect with their own lives. And so there's this kind of bridge of empathy that, like, that's created. And I think that leads to other kinds of understanding, emotional understandings. I mean, I think we've all had an experience where we read a poem and we're like, we can't really articulate what it means, but something touched us deeply and and at times, as you realize, it's changed your life. And you won't even know exactly what that means, maybe for months or years. And I think, just like music, some of our favorite songs are not written about us. They're just the singer songwriter is bearing their lives and their experiences as a way for us to connect through that bridge of emotion or empathy.
I noticed in the first part of your book that you inserted a few ekphrastic poems. Do you think there's a connection between poetry and visual art as well?
I think so. And I think in this book in particular, I'm having a lot of conversations with art itself, which for me is kind of where I am in this journey of questioning what home is. And part of it, I'm understanding that art itself is a home, is a place to be and exist. And so that's part of what I am doing there. Poems with visual art, also with photographers, also with musicians, also with obviously other poets. But the ekphrastic poems in particular, um, I would I would say yes, because there's an obvious, visual element in the ways that we use imagery, right? The ways that we use colors and forms, and whatnot. But I'd still say that it's closer to music and to visual arts in my sense. Um, it, and also, I think drama. I mean, there's the drama element of it, right? This is really
Right.
where poetry begins. And poetry is meant to be in the room. It's meant to be like music, but it's also, there's another layer that happens when you recite a poem, whether it's your own or someone else's. Something changes in the way that we understand the poem, but also in the way it's sort of received in us.
Mhm.
But yeah, the visual artists, I look to their lives also as well, not just necessarily the work, but also um, sort of a conversation about what does it mean to make art, right? Uh, what are the similarities or differences in the ways that we live in the world as artists? And sometimes you want to do that with form, like
Mhm.
a painting or a painter, because it offers you another opportunity to discover something else about perhaps yourself and you and one as a poet.
You've mentioned that your negotiation of cultural identity and themes of place and belonging often appear in your work. Could you talk about the tension of belonging versus that feeling of being on the outside, and how has the tension of inside versus outside characterized your life experiences thus far? And maybe how does that appear in your work?
I mean, belonging is sort of I mean, we can think of home, right, as sort of maybe the physical representation of something, right? Like where we live, the city. Oh, I love New York, or I hate New York, or like, or shopping for a
Mhm.
new country these days. But, but
True.
so there's like sort of that physical idea. And I think belonging opens up to that sense of the emotion behind that sense of home and place. And so, um, there's I've always been searching for a physical home as well to represent my emotional sense of belonging, right? So they two sort of go together. It's like, obviously chicken, maybe not the chicken or the egg, but we can like a place for what it looks like, but we may not necessarily connect with it emotionally. But there's on several levels for me that has always been part of my life's journey, and of course, as reflected in my work. One of them, of course, is being an immigrant or a child of. And I'm an immigrant by 45 days, so still counts, but still the experience is the same in a richly traditional uh, Cuban immigrant family.
Mhm.
And so there is always this idea that I belonged to, or as I like to say, I was always living between two real imagined worlds. One was, of course, the Cuba of my parents, my grandparents, and the Miami exile community at large. This place that I belonged to, but I wasn't even born there. I was born in Madrid. So this place that was culturally my home, but still, what is that even? How am I supposed to feel that I belong to it, right? And eventually I did go to Cuba and started making connections in a different way. But the other real imagined world was the United States. Growing up in Miami, as we like to say, we love living here because it's so close to the United States. Um, you kind of grow up, thinking about, well, where is that other America that I see on TV, especially in the 1970s? That other, who's that other little boy that I'm supposed to be that I see on TV? What are all these strange foods like peanut butter? And so you belong to the United States, right? But
Right.
do you really? I mean, you're here physically. Is another sense of belonging. And a third one, which was fairly not fairly recent, but maybe in my third, I had sort of, I had never connected the idea of my sexuality. I had never written much about my sexuality until my third book. And I had just had made the connection of, or how these two things fit, how home and belonging fit to being a gay man in the world and a gay child, since I can remember. Um, and of course, it's that belonging in the sense of another kind of home and another kind of belonging, which is um, a place where you can live your life without shame or fear or be supported. Uh, when you come out, you have to reconstruct your whole sense of community and belonging. And you know, luckily, when I was growing up, there was still a lot of gay bars. There was a culture around that, and it
Right.
was more than, to me as I look back, it was more than way more than just a place to pick up people, but rather it's where you learn the ropes. You learned how to socialize as a gay man. You learned, what to do, what not to do, how to read people. You made friends, and in a way that was home. That was the home that one had to grow up in a way, a second time. So that's always been a big shift. And now with Homeland of My Body, um, I think it partly was because of the pandemic, but also because I'm middle aged. But but also, every book for me is an exploration of some dimension of home, and I just trust that my mind will find what it's next or where it's landing on next.
Hmm.
And again, because of sort of in a way thinking about mortality in different ways now, um, I kind of have, well, like the title of the book says Homeland of My Body, like it's all in me. Like I've never gained a home or lost a home. It's the conglomeration of all those experiences that create a more profound sense of belonging that comes from the inside, not from the outside. Um, and and I think that's the space I'm in now. It's I wouldn't say it's a letting go of the question. It's just more of a kind of peacefulness with where it is right now. And yeah, and I've gone through like many journeys, so this is the most peaceful one that I've had in terms of the question of home and belonging.
Excellent. So, in your new collection, there's a mixture of some new work with some of the older pieces. What was the selection process like, for what to include and maybe what to exclude for that matter? And is this idea of home the central organizational thread?
Yeah. I mean, yes. I mean, and by default, right? Because
Right.
that's what my books have been playing with all their lives. Um, the selection process, there's a couple of things or parameters you're trying to pay attention to that I learned because this is my first new and selected. And so as far as poems from previous collections, um, uh, my editor and also my agent were cognizant it's not your best poems are not always the best poem for new and selected. Right, you want sometimes poems that didn't get a lot of playtime but were important, but for some reason, whatever, maybe I never sent it out for consideration in a magazine, or it's a longer poem that I don't read at readings. So it was not just picking the best poem, but what are some of these touch points that have been important to that particular collection, but that haven't had that, again, a much playtime. And then, of course, trying to make sure that the arc of each individual book is fairly represented in the poems you select, because each book is its own little universe, and it has its beginning, middle, and end, and you want to also make sure that works. There's also the practical matter of not including too many poems because
Right.
you run into reprint issues, which is a whole other thing that I learned. So that was part of it, right? Like limiting the number of poems that told the story. What was really fascinating, and this was something that just like sort of really surprised me. Well, I shouldn't be surprised by now because I know the mind is writing poems that you're not even aware of, or is writing in a way that you're just trusting the process.
Mm.
But and I had never seen a book like this. So the new poems are split between two sections, a beginning section and an ending section.
Mhm.
And so I started crafting, or almost not, it was already there, but I started more choosing poems in a way, in an order that segued into the old poems and then came back into the new poems in a way that felt interesting. And part of it is here I am in this new idea or a new sense of home and belonging. And so those are the first maybe 15, 16 poems. And then I ended up moving back to part-time to Miami, to Surfside, which is where I had my very first apartment when I went off on my own. And so the rest of the old poems are almost like a flashback to, okay, here I am at the end of the journey, but let me tell you how this happened. Let me tell you how I ended up sitting on the same beach where I wrote my first book.
Right.
Coming
That was
back,
sort of the sense that I got from
yeah,
reading it, was that it was like, okay, here's the story of my life,
right.
this book, and I liked how you sort of divided those new poems into two parts, and how you opened with the first part and you called it Radiant Being, And then the second part of the new poems you called Here I Am. Could you talk about how you chose those titles and maybe why?
So they're titles from the poems. Radiant Beings for me connects to what we were talking about earlier, like sort of all the connections to art and painting and artists and music and whatnot. And thinking about about the artist as the radiant being, right? Like how do I live in that space? What does that bring me? How is that? What does that offer the world, right? What is that light that we have inside and we share and perhaps emit. Um, and then Here I Am, also a title poem. Was also again moving back here. The beach is part of my um psyche, right? Like it's growing up since I was a kid. It's in a way my religion, or not my religion, but my God. It's where I go to center myself. It's where I go to humble myself. It's where I go to surrender. It's where I go to ask what's next.
Right,
And I
right.
don't think of some white guy in a beard or anything like that, but just connecting. Well, sometimes I do. But 14 years of Roman Catholic
Right.
still does things to you, but uh it's really a conversation with the divine in oneself, right? And so here I am, and that poem is like, here I am again, you know, here I am. And uh the idea of still being on this beach and still on this journey and returning, and also being, I've always thought, getting back to your first question, in another way that I think poetry is in a way part, is in a way part service. You're in service to humanity. And so in some ways that question of here I am. So for our listeners, right? I Who knows where poems come from, but like um they all come in different ways. But I don't even remember where I was reading that the difference in Hebrew between saying I am here and here I am.
Mhm.
And the latter is one of humility, right? And it's one of like, not I am here, here I am, which means sort of like I'm here to accept whatever is being asked of me, know what's being asked of me. And so I just totally geeked out on that. And of course, it doesn't translate, I think, as in terms of English, but I became really fascinated by how different those two phrases are. And so the last, how it relates to the whole section, in a sense, it is all in some ways an act of surrender, in more ways than one. I can't handle it, but it's also letting go of all the inherited trauma of exile. It's a letting go of all the homophobia of my grandmother. It's a letting go in a way, the physical need or representation of home, and just letting it be inside me, right? Be in my body, in a kind of a spiritual confidence of um, or it's, I think, was it Anais Nin, or maybe it was me? I don't know. That said, no matter where you are, no matter where you go, there you are. Right. So
Yeah, I don't
that's
remember. I don't remember who said that, but I've heard it a million times.
right. Right. So maybe it wasn't anybody that interesting that said it, but yeah. So that's how the titles relate. And at first I wasn't going to title them, but
Uh,
I thought it was helpful because since the two sections are far apart, right? Like, so that
mm,
people know, oh, there's a thought behind why they are grouped in this way.
I think it definitely felt more like a journey because you titled it that way, I think. Do you have a favorite piece in the new collection? What is it that you love about it?
There's a couple, for varying reasons, like Become Me, which is the love poem to my husband. And I don't know why, other than it does something to me. And that doesn't happen with every poem where you read it and yourself
Mm,
get choked up. Like, okay,
mm,
like maybe it's because I discovered something in there, or I confirmed something that I sort of felt but didn't know I felt. So, and it's very brief, which is not my usual. I am Cuban. I talk a lot. I'm a long writer. Please, like a sonnet. I'm just getting started with 14 lines. And then the other poem was, which is a longer poem, and that's in the first section, is called Why I Needed to. Um, and I think there it was also, sometimes you write poems out of sort of an idea, you write poems out of a memory, but that poem was written out of an urgency. I was losing my mind, like, um, and um, and I don't mean that. I don't mean to say that so lightly. And by that I mean I'm fine mentally, mental health wise. It's just like my life is crazy. Like, I mean, I travel 70% of my time. I'm also like a workaholic, or I should say, have that immigrant, like, work ethic. Like, I gotta like work 14 hours a day, or you're always afraid you're gonna run out of, like, so a lot on my plate. And of course, I'm not to toot my own horn, but I also try to be generous with people and write blurbs and so I went to the beach to the Betsy Hotel. They had offered me to stay there like 4 days. They have this beautiful writer's room. The owner's father is a pretty well known poet. And I was so stressed out that it took me like 3 days of just sitting there going like, blah, 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 blah. And finally on the last day, I'm sitting on the beach and I'm watching life go around me, and like the kids playing and the parents. And I started bawling, and I'm like, and that sense of just being in the moment. And so the poem is about getting to that moment, really. And like, it's basically like a kiss off poem. Like, I'm not, screw email and screw this, that, and like I'm tired of this and I'm tired of that, but in a way that's not angry, but just kind of I had it with myself. Like, please take care of yourself, Richard. Like,
Right.
and just to be. I mean, those moments get harder and harder. It's the double-edged sword of having a degree of success in any field, right? Like, you're like suddenly I just constantly it's like Maxime Kim used to call it po biz, like, because I spend more time like on the business end of it and picking flights and blah, 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 like this. What do you this, that, and
Right.
the other, then, and also taking time. You're a maker of art, and now your art is also a career. It's no longer just a vocation. There's a fine, but then I become less of a consumer. That pisses me off because I just went to see like 3 plays in New York City, in the middle of working on a musical. But I was like, I better see some musicals while I'm here. And I was
Right.
like, oh my god, and just to have be the receiver of art, right? And like, just that's something I always got to remember too, and not just always the maker.
Would you mind reading one of those two poems? You can choose whichever you like.
Yeah. Why I needed to. Because I faithfully replied to every email from the absurd gods of urgency who punish my good deeds by leaving me empty when I empty my inbox. Because I praise hating myself, broken into my calendar's time slotted tasks, slicing me thin with the thick duty of being everything, yet nothing to anyone, not even me, because I remember birthdays but forget my own and my mother's, because she is bittersweet as the Cuban coffee she brews after Sunday dinners, because she only loves me in the language of her cooking my favorite dish, papas, because of my bland father who sunk in his armchair without me his lap, because he never told me the life story I finally read in the half moons of his eyes the morning he gazed into mine, then died. Because my brother and I need to drink to share our shared hurt at happy hour, so unhappily grateful for love's wreckage. Because my husband, who's still scared of his adoration for me as we embrace sleep, still doubts how long I'll nest my dreams in his arms, because I have never quite told him always, because I am as afraid of needing him more than myself, because I am not the one I've curated on Instagram. Oh, so humbled by, so grateful for, so many posted blessings with my posed selves. Because tonight I again remember I'm nothing more than a mirage, slowly disappearing on my porch, sitting with half the life I have left, trying to piece how I fit into the puzzle of the constellations, because I've drank their shots of light and too many martinis, because I'm cheering mindlessly to the moon, to my wish for immortality amid the clouds of my own cigarette smoke, because I should finally quit doubting my life will be more than these anonymous bones, because I need to believe in something else truer than me, because that's why today I had to take myself away to the beach, because I needed to imagine my father as that father at the shore, handing a bouquet of seashells to his son, because I needed to taste that love can be simple as a mother remembering to pack sodas and sandwiches, because I needed the seagulls tending the horizon to teach me again to be as still as them, peer calmly into the void of the skies I face, because I needed to hear the waves break and break and break and break me into the lines for this poem, because I needed to burn, to see myself shine just as beautifully as the rosy glow of the sunlight bathing my closed eyes.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for that. One of my personal favorites is The Splintering, which is the opening poem of the collection. So could you talk about maybe what prompted that piece and why you decided to make it the opening piece?
Um, sure. God, poetry is like the weirdest thing in the world. Like, so I have this one of my oldest childhood memories, and I must have been probably less than 4 years old, was getting a splinter in my hand, and my mother sort of tenderly pulling it out and whatnot. And I that moment has always stuck with me, and I'm not sure why. And I just finally had to write this poem to figure out why. And I think it was the first time that I realized my mortality in some ways, or that I wasn't, or consciousness, right? That when you're before that age, your body and your soul and everything, or what your conscious, just like, it's not divided, right? It's not like
Mhm.
there's no, everything is one thing. You're just a being. You just be, right? And the idea that I was a physical being, even, right? Not just a mental being, but a physical being. And my mother's worried about the splinter, and like, thinking, like, why is she so freaked out? Like, like, it's like, what? Like, so anyway, so it's also, of course, it's the play on the words of the splintering of when our minds divide from our souls, or from our consciousness, or our consciousness is born and suddenly understands these two things in the world. And I think I chose it because I think, as an opening piece, because in some ways that also is, to me, on many levels, it's also the beginning uh, of poetry in some way, of like understanding the world through one's consciousness, right? On that level, also it's sort of, symbolically, I'm sort of born. It's like I'm being born again in that very first poem. Like, here is, and then the one that follows too, playing God, right? Like,
Mhm.
about thinking about my childhood, and where did this artist, where did this poet arise from, right? Like, what are some of the metaphors for that, right? How did all this sort of happen? So, I call kind of like they're almost like little origin stories about how this human being, this conscious human being, came to be, grow up, and write poems. Right?
Right, right. Would you mind reading that piece for us?
Sure. As I was saying earlier,
Uh,
like how poetry lives, outside of the page, and so I'm still getting familiar on how to read these poems, and they're still teaching me about them as I read them, and sometimes
right.
processes years. It's kind of like, okay, I wrote the lyrics to the song, but now I got to sing it. And something else happens, and you're like suddenly start improvising, and like you're like, but anyway, um, the splintering. As a boy, all body, my body part of all that was. My ears were the wind my cheeks heard, my mouth the thunder that roared in my chest, my face in the face of rain puddles cupped in my palms, my lips the wet petals my nose kissed. And I blindly saw the stars as my eyes, luring me that night to climb up our backyard mango tree. It, its trunk the will of my spine, my arms, every branch's arms, coddling the wind, its bark, the thick flesh of my hands, needled with splinters when I fell into my mother's tearful cries. Ay, Dios mío! I couldn't grasp her urgency, why she had to tenderly soak my hands as if I was some sort of hurt animal she had to heal, why she spent hours pulling out every splinter with her tweezers, a surgeon operating on me in her housecoat and terry cloth slippers, why her teary words, it's okay, just a few more, mijo. You could have died. Die? I knew nothing of dying. Then she kissed the last bead of blood on my finger and said, I love you. Meaning, what she'd love forever was more than my body, which suddenly split from me into abstract breaths in the mouth of my mind, for the first time saying to itself, death, joy, loss, saying, I love you too, Mama.
You were saying earlier how sometimes it doesn't make sense, like why certain poems touch you and others don't. This is one that really touches me deeply. It's just so beautiful.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much. Thank you.
Well, good. I'm glad because this is the first one. That's a very important one.
Yes. um, well, thank you so much for being with us today and for the conversation. We're really grateful. It was great to spend time with you. Richard Blanco's new book is Homeland of My Body, New and Selected Poems, and it's forthcoming from Beacon Press very soon. It'll be available on October 24th. Richard, congratulations on your new book, and thank you again for being with us.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you.
And I'm Ken Harmon. I'm editor and founder of West Trade Review, and thank you all for being with us for the latest episode of the Postscript interview series. If you enjoyed today's interview, please consider liking our YouTube channel and following us on social media. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.